Finally, the Romans 8:23 passage where Paul says we await adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Richard says, what that is referring to is the release of our inner resurrection body, which Richard identifies with the inner man, the new man in Christ. And he's saying, what Paul is saying there is we're awaiting the release of this resurrection spiritual body inside of us, which will come out when Christ returns. Well, the problem with that is that depends upon this absurd thesis that Richard has, that no one agrees to, that the resurrection body is identical to what Paul calls my inner man, and that this is growing inside of you until finally it will come out at the resurrection as a distinct body. And this body, the earthly body, will fall away like a discarded husk. Nobody thinks that Paul believed that. This has more in common with the movie Alien than with Pauline thought. There is no grounds at all for thinking that Paul identified the resurrection body with the inner man or the new man in Christ. So again, Richard's attempt to explain away the force of Romans 8:23 is just utterly implausible. So I think you can see that in order to avoid the force of these passages, in every case he has to resort to wresting words out of context, twisting meaning of words, mistranslation. In 1 Corinthians 15, he does the same thing there, Kevin. For example, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, he uses the word alasso, which means to change. Now, this word has the same range of meanings as the English word change. Sometimes it means intrinsic change in a single subject. For example, meeting an old friend, you might say, "My, how you've changed." That would be intrinsic change in that subject. But sometimes the word can mean exchange. For example, if I say, "I changed money at the airport," there we're not talking about an intrinsic change, but an exchange. Now, when you get to 1 Corinthians 15, contrary to Richard, Paul never says, we will change bodies, like an exchange. We will change bodies. Paul doesn't say that. Rather, what he says is, the trumpet will sound, the dead in Christ will be raised, and we shall be changed. It is clearly talking about intrinsic change, and it makes no sense at all to interpret this as extrinsic change. Moreover, Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 4 times verbs that have as their implicit subject the same subject. He says, it is sown, it is raised. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown in perishability, it is raised in imperishability. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. The same implicit subject for those contrasts. Richard, to avoid the implication, has to mistranslate the passage. He translates it as, one is sown, one that is a different one is raised. And that's just a mistranslation of the passage. So again, in 1 Corinthians 15, you can see that same tendentious mistranslation, misinterpretation in order to avoid the plain sense of the passage. And what I want to say too here, Kevin, is this doesn't require a knowledge of Greek to see this. Any careful reader of an English Bible can see these facts if you will just read Paul as he is meant to be read on the surface.
Now, Richard is saying all this from an atheist standpoint, by the way. He doesn't believe in Christianity at all.
No.
He's only trying to evaluate what Paul believes.
Yes, that's right, Kevin. And therefore, he can be objective if he only will be. I mean, even a Buddhist or a non-Christian of any stripe ought to be able to read the correspondence of Paul and say, this is what this man believed. He was crazy. I don't agree with him, but this is what he believed. But Richard is so biased against Christianity, so intent on refuting Christianity, that it's almost like it blinds him, Kevin, to objectively reading these texts. And it's not just Paul. As I studied for this debate, I was just amazed how over and over again Richard can't seem to read these texts in an objective manner. He distorts what Josephus says. He grossly distorts what the Church Father Origen believed about the resurrection body and how it comes to be. I mean, his interpretation of Origen is so tendentious and so wrong as to be almost slanderous, frankly, of the Church Father. And the same is true when he comes to reading N.T. Wright, when he reads A.N. Sherwin White. He just can't seem to read these authors in an objective prima facie way. He is so blinded by his prejudice against Christianity that he twists and distorts the meaning of these authors. So what I came to see in studying for this debate was that if Richard gives a reference to somebody, you better go check out that reference. You just can't rely on him to give you an objective, trustworthy interpretation of the sources that he cites. And I think this is unfortunate because, as you say, many young people reading his work will see it bristling with these footnotes, just heavily documented. It looks so impressive. And he speaks with such confidence that you can really be taken in unless you take the trouble to go look up the references and read them yourself. And then a very, very different picture begins to emerge. So you're quite right. He is an atheist, doesn't believe what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15, but nevertheless, he ought to be able to give us an objective interpretation of what Paul thought. And I don't think he does that. Instead, I think he seriously misconstrues Paul. He resorts to mistranslation, to wresting words out of context, to distortion of meaning in order to put through his very idiosyncratic interpretation of Paul.
Richard is trained as an historian, and
Yes.
But he seems to be influenced by a book that was written a while back about a comparison of the Gospel of Mark and the Homeric epic.
Yes.
It seems that he sees everything through the lens of ancient writers only parroting other works that they were familiar with, copying them. Do you see that at all? Is this a poor historical method just because there are similarities?
Oh, yes. I think this is right, Kevin. He's very much, as you say, in sympathy with the views of this MacDonald that says that the Passion narrative, indeed the whole Gospel of Mark, is built on and constructed out of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And scarcely anybody thinks that's correct. I mean, it's so fantastic.
Yeah, the book was interesting, but it certainly wasn't received
No.
as far as I've been able to see.
No, I mean, what MacDonald has to do is he, as you say, finds any kind of little parallel. Like in the Iliad, Hector is slain by his enemies. He is mourned by women, and then he's given a burial. And this is supposed to be the source of Mark's crucifixion and burial narrative for Jesus. Well, you can find those kind of parallels to virtually anything. And in fact, in a sense, Richard shows this himself because he'll try to show there are parallels with the Iliad and the Odyssey, but there are also parallels with the story of Jacob removing the stone from the well to water the camels. But there are also parallels to the story of Daniel in the lion's den, where the stone is rolled away from the lion's den. But there are also parallels to the Orphic mystery religions, where the initiates go into the underworld after death. The very abundance of parallels actually undermines his case because it shows you that you can find parallels to anything. And that doesn't prove literary dependence.
No, that's why I worry about that method,
Oh,
because it seems like you just can't know any history. Everything is just an amalgamation of a bunch of floating stories, and you can put whatever interpretation you want.
It's untestable. You can't falsify it, because if you say, well, look at these differences between, say, the Iliad and the Gospels, what they'll say is, but that's actually evidence for dependence, because it shows how Mark changed the Homeric narrative so as to conceal its dependence. So the similarities are taken as evidence of literary dependence, and then the differences are taken also as evidence of literary dependence, so that it becomes utterly unfalsifiable and vacuous. And therefore, this is a terrible method of literary interpretation.